It's hard to believe that it's been over 6 years since I transitioned out of the ministry at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. I'd been the senior minister there for 40 years, and it was a wonderful experience. I'm thrilled that the transition plan at Southeast worked really well, partly because the plan was good, mostly because my successor is a really good man. But since I left, the attendance has continued to increase, about 3,000 people. They've got a renewed prayer emphasis. They've started 2 satellite churches with a 3rd on the way. I've been asked with increased frequency to share our experience because good transitions are rare. Crystal Cathedral is a recent sad example of a failed transition. Robert Schuler's plan was to turn over the reins to his son Bob, but what happened was complex, but that national effective ministry experienced division, then bankruptcy, and no longer exists. There was family strife, congregational disappointment, and the enemy of Christ was given an occasion to blaspheme. Well, ours at Southeast Christian went well. It was not as high profile as Crystal Cathedral, and we didn't intend it to be a model for everyone because every situation is unique. Every church needs to develop a plan that is fitted to their needs. But as I walk through my experience with you and what I learned, hopefully it will stimulate your thinking and motivate you to develop an even better plan. I've recently been asked by a networking group called Slingshot to team with several others in providing a consulting service about transitions for churches and businesses. And it's an in-depth subject. You can check that out through slingshotgroup.org. But in 2 Timothy, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 and 2, the Apostle Paul wrote, "You then, my son, be strong that is in the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And the things that you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will be qualified to teach others." There are 3 reasons why a church should have a transition plan. The first is there's a biblical precedent for it. Moses had Joshua, David had Solomon, Elijah had Elisha, Paul had Timothy, Barnabas had John Mark, and Jesus mentored 12 disciples to take over when he ascended into heaven. Those biblical examples had some common characteristics. The successor was chosen by God long before the mentor's death. The successor was trained by the mentor who allowed them to work alongside and gave them firsthand experience. And then the mentor stepped out of the way, or was taken completely out of the way when the time for transition came. So we're not talking about a new concept, but a biblical concept. A second reason for a transition plan is the example from the business world. Most of you are aware that huge corporations are now giving more attention to succession because they've seen businesses rise and fall on the strength of the CEO, and now they're thinking long term. Boeing went into the tank when the CEO retired and they had to call him back from retirement. Humana, a Louisville-based healthcare industry, got into trouble when David Jones retired, and they brought him back after 5 years. GE, Chrysler had similar experiences. Analysts have seen what happens to businesses that aren't prepared for transition, and they're sounding a warning. So we need to admit our leadership is temporary, and we need to enable the church or the company to go beyond our tenure. They say, develop somebody from within who knows your culture and can take over and hit the ground running. Jim Collins, a popular business author who wrote Built to Last and Good to Great, in Built to Last, he has an entire section on mentoring. And he writes, "Don't fall into the trap of thinking that the only way to bring about change and progress at the top is to bring in outsiders who might dilute or destroy the core. The key," he says, "is to develop and promote insiders who are highly capable of stimulating healthy change and progress while still preserving the core." Jesus said the children of darkness are wiser in dealing with their own kind than are the children of light. Often, people in the world will somehow do more for money than the church will do for Jesus Christ. That shouldn't be. If succession is important in business, how much more important it ought to be in kingdom business that was built to last for eternity. A third reason for developing a transition plan is just common sense. Common sense demands it, especially for those of us involved in larger, more complex ministries. We need to think long term. Many churches and schools and parachurch organizations grind to a halt when the visionary leader leaves, or he dies, or he's removed. So even if you're not nearing retirement, you need to face the possibility that something could happen to you that would take you out of the picture. What's going to happen to your church or your parachurch organization when that occurs? There were two events that seemed to motivate our leaders to begin to think seriously about a transition plan. First was the accusation that maybe Southeast was a personality cult. When we were growing rapidly, people in the community would sometimes challenge, yeah, but what's going to happen when Bob Russell dies or Bob Russell takes a dive? And they would say it's temporary. The second factor that motivated us to think about transition was that I read a book called Too Great a Temptation by Joel Gregory. And it's about the failure to transition the ministry at the First Baptist Church in Dallas, which was a flagship church. W.A. Criswell called in Joel Gregory to be his successor because he was nearing 80 years old. But it was handled so poorly that it nearly split the church. It was an embarrassment to one of the great churches in that movement. And as I read that book, I thought, boy, we cannot allow this to happen at Southeast Church. And I asked all of our elders to read that book. And afterward, all of them said, let's learn from that experience. Let's do better than that. Let's lay the groundwork to have a transition plan. Then the question becomes, how do we select and how do we mentor a successor? Track coaches tell us that the passing of the baton in a track relay takes a lot of teamwork. The runners practice the handoff of the baton more than any other phase of competition. And that's often where the race is won or lost. To drop the baton spells almost certain defeat. There are a number of parallels that are essential to successful mentoring. Number one, the runner carrying the baton has to keep going full speed during the transition. He can't let up, although he's tired and his phase of the race is almost over. He's entering the most crucial phase. Secondly, the person receiving the baton must begin running prior to the arrival of the one approaching. If he waits until the runner passing the baton is even with him, he'll be bypassed. So he's got to start running before he receives the baton. Thirdly, the two of them must stay in the same lane. A transition is not going to be effective if the mentor and the mentee aren't heading in the same direction. Then fourthly, there must be a timely release and reception. In fact, that's marked out on the track. The approaching runner yells, "Go," when it's time for the next runner to take off. And then when the baton is in the extended hand, the back man yells, "Take," and the transition occurs. One has to release, the other receive at full speed. Fifthly, if the transition is made smoothly, there actually should be a step gained in the race because one is reaching back to receive, the other is reaching forward to give. When Rick Pitino turned the reins of the University of Kentucky basketball team over to his former assistant Tubby Smith in the late 90s, the first year Tubby Smith won the national championship. That's great when a step is gained in the transition. Sixthly, the one who passes the baton gets out of the way and roots for the one running. The one who's just released the baton doesn't keep running alongside the fresh athlete to coach him or to criticize him. He usually just cuts across the infield to the finish line and cheers for the end result. Nothing messes up a mentoring friendship or a successful transition like the mentor second-guessing or criticizing the new guy. When Elijah's ministry was over, he was gone. He's taken up in a fiery chariot. And Elisha, his successor, picked up the mantle and the work of God continued. He touched the Jordan River with it and the river parted. Charles Swindoll points out, when a man of God dies, nothing of God dies. The power was still there. Now, we've tried to adapt those principles of the relay in our church transition plan. Dave Stone my successor was already on staff as a second preaching pastor. He didn't come in as the designated successor. He originally was hired as a college minister and associate teaching pastor. Initially, he was given, I think, 6 weekends the first year, and each year he had an additional weekend. Well, the congregation just fell in love with him. He comes from a great family. He's extremely gifted and personable, humorous, and he's an enjoyable speaker. And he's also 15 years younger than I. Now, initially, there was no promise that he would inherit the pulpit, but the congregation could soon see that the handwriting was on the wall. In the year 2000, at the elder's request, I worked on a transition plan over the summer. And in the fall, I brought it back to the elders. And it said, we will keep adding 1 preaching opportunity every year to Dave Stone, and Dave Stone will be my successor. Now that would mean around the year 2006, Dave and I would be preaching about an equal number of weekends. And we also decided we would immediately add Dave to the preaching rotation on our radio program in the Louisville area, so the Louisville community would identify him with the church. And another part of that plan was within 3 or 4 years, we would hire a third minister to teach, preferably younger than Dave, to share the pulpit duties. He would be included in the preaching rotation as soon as he was hired, and his gifts would complement Dave Stone. And then when I left, he would share the pulpit with Dave as I had been doing for the last several years. Then we said sometime in the year 2006, I would step aside. I'd move out of the church altogether and stay away for at least a year. In the interim, before that happened, we would mentor the successor by teaching, association, giving additional responsibilities. I announced this transition plan to the congregation 5 years out. And I told them that my termination date would be June of the year 2006, which would be my 40th anniversary. I said, you know, the Israelites put up with Moses for 40 years, and some in the church had put up with me that long, and they needed a break. And I pointed out, I don't intend to retire, but I intend to have another chapter in my life when I can go on and refire and enter some new facet of ministry. There is tremendous pressure in being a minister of a large church, in any church. And I found that stress increasing as I aged. This transition plan worked well for us. Betty Willman, a colorful, outspoken member of our church, older woman, once told me that she was tired of people asking, what's going to happen to your church when Bob Russell dies? Well, after we announced the transition plan, a woman in the community challenged her, yeah, but what happens when Bob Russell dies? And she quipped, well, we'll bury the dude and go on. The congregation developed a renewed confidence about the future, and we felt our best days were going to be ahead of us. And this knowledge of what was going to happen was good for Dave, too. People understood and turned to him for leadership. He stepped up his maturing process, and the transition plan was good for me. I wasn't looking over my shoulder wondering, when should I retire? Do people think I've lost it? Who's trying to undermine me? How much longer should I stay? And I became a better preacher because I didn't preach every week. I was forced to sit in the pew and listen, and there was more time to dig the well for the next time. And I was motivated by the effectiveness of those who were in the pulpit. And when I got up to preach, I think the congregation was more eager to hear me preach. If a preacher is up front, leading worship, giving the pastoral prayer, making announcements, preaching every sermon, promoting every event, familiarity will eventually kill him. People have heard his voice so much they tune it out. I really think it's essential for an effective long-term ministry for the preacher to be up front less, to back off. And I was able to stay fresh for 40 years because of this mentoring concept.